In the vast expanse of the Galactic Confederation, where 1,000 species have learned to coexist through careful diplomacy and strict protocols, there exists one fundamental truth that every civilized being acknowledges. Humans are terrifying. Not because they're the strongest. The Krillian warbears could crush a human skull with one paw. Not because they're the smartest. The crystalline Vedhans process information at speeds that would make human computers weep. Not even because they're the most technologically advanced. Half a dozen species had mastered faster-than-light travel before humans even discovered fire. No, humans are terrifying because they come from a world that shouldn't exist. A world so hostile, so unforgiving, so absolutely murderous in every conceivable way that the Galactic Confederation officially classified it as a Class 12 Deathworld. A rating so extreme, they had to create a new category just for Earth. And yet, somehow, impossibly, humans thrive there. Now imagine taking one of these apex survivors, a young woman who grew up swimming with creatures that could swallow a shuttle whole, who learned to walk on ground that could open up and devour cities without warning, who treated volcanic eruptions like mild weather. And imagine placing her in the Confederation's most prestigious military academy, surrounded by species who consider a paper cut a medical emergency. The instructors thought they knew what they were dealing with. They thought their centuries of experience training the galaxy's elite would be enough. They thought wrong. Some lessons can only be taught by a Deathworld girl who learned to laugh in the face of annihilation before she could properly speak. This is the story of how Cadet Sarah Chun turned the most disciplined military academy in the galaxy upside down, not through rebellion or defiance, but through something far more dangerous, being herself. The transport shuttle descended through the artificial atmosphere of Kepler Station with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, its hull gleaming against the backdrop of the Andromeda Nebula. Inside, pressed against a viewport that offered a spectacular view of the galaxy's most prestigious military academy, Sarah Chun watched with eyes that held the kind of calm focus her instructors back on Earth had called disturbingly intense. At 19 standard years old, Sarah possessed the lean, efficient build that came from growing up on a world where weakness meant death. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her olive skin bore the subtle scars that marked every human who had survived to adulthood on the planet the rest of the galaxy called that nightmarish death trap. To Sarah, it was simply home. The other passengers on the shuttle maintained a careful distance from the human cadet. A group of Altarian delegates whispered among themselves in their musical language, their crystalline forms refracting the shuttle's interior lighting into rainbow patterns. Near the back, a delegation of Vraxian military advisors sat in perfect formation, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming like polished armor. None of them looked directly at Sarah, but she could feel their attention like a physical weight. She was used to it. Humans have been part of the Galactic Confederation for only 37 years, and in that time, they had developed quite a reputation. Not all of it was flattering. Attention passengers. The shuttle's AI announced in the neutral, pleasant tone that all Confederation technology used. We are now approaching the Kepler Military Academy. Please prepare for docking procedures. Through the viewport, Sarah watched as the academy grew larger. The structure was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry combined, a sprawling complex of interconnected spheres and towers that seemed to float in the void like a metallic constellation. Each section was designed to accommodate different atmospheric and gravitational requirements, allowing cadets from hundreds of worlds to train together in comfort. Comfort. Sarah almost smiled at the thought. The docking was smooth and silent, the kind of perfect maneuver that spoke to technology refined over millennia. As the passengers began to file out, Sarah noticed how they naturally arranged themselves in order of species hierarchy, a subtle but ingrained behavior that spoke to the Confederation's long history of careful diplomatic balance. Humans, being the newest members, and coming from what the galactic community politely termed unusual circumstances, ranked somewhere near the bottom of that hierarchy. Sarah didn't mind. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. The Academy's reception area was a marvel of multicultural design, with sections adapted for beings who breathed different gases, operated in different temperature ranges, and experienced different gravitational norms. Sarah walked through what the signs marked as the carbon-based humanoid section, where the atmosphere was a carefully balanced mixture that could support dozens of similar species. At the reception desk, a being that looked like a cross between an octopus and a flower greeted each new arrival with enthusiasm that seemed genuinely heartfelt. When Sarah's turn came, the receptionist's tentacles performed what she recognized as the Gallian gesture of welcome, accompanied by a burst of bioluminescent colors that probably conveyed additional meaning in the being's native language. Cadet Sarah Chun, from the Sol System, the receptionist said, consulting a holographic display that materialized in the air between them. Welcome to the Kepler Military Academy. You've been assigned to Barracks Complex 7, Room 2847. Your orientation begins in 2 standard hours. Do you have any immediate questions about our facilities or procedures? Sarah shook her head politely. Thank you. I'm sure I'll figure things out. The receptionist's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what Sarah guessed was surprise. Most new cadets, she imagined, arrive with extensive questions about everything from atmospheric composition to dietary requirements. Humans, however, had developed a certain reputation for adaptability. Very well, the receptionist said. Your room assignment include a comprehensive information packet about Academy life, including emergency procedures, dietary accommodations, and cultural sensitivity guidelines. Please don't hesitate to contact the administration if you need anything. Sarah accepted the small device that would guide her to her quarters and merged into the flow of beings moving through the Academy's corridors. The architecture was designed to be impressive, and it succeeded, soaring spaces filled with natural light from carefully positioned artificial stars, walls that displayed shifting patterns of color and movement that seemed to respond to the emotions of those nearby, and a pervasive sense of order and purpose that spoke to the Academy's mission of training the galaxy's future military leaders. The corridors were busy with cadets going about their daily routines. Sarah observed them as she walked, noting the easy confidence of those who belonged to established military traditions, the careful deference of species that had joined the Confederation more recently, and the complex social dynamics that governed interactions between beings whose ancestors had never shared the same sky. Her assigned quarters were in a section designed for humanoid species, with artificial gravity set to approximately Earth normal and an atmospheric mixture that would support human physiology. The room itself was larger than her entire living space back on Earth had been, a luxury that spoke to the Academy's resources and the Confederation's commitment to accommodating the needs of diverse species. The information packet materialized as a holographic display when she activated the room systems. Sarah scanned through the basics: meal schedules, training rotations, academic requirements, and social guidelines. The Academy operated on a standard Confederation day cycle, which was slightly longer than Earth's 24-hour rotation. The training regimen looked rigorous, but familiar: physical conditioning, tactical studies, leadership development, and specialized training based on individual aptitudes and career tracks. What caught her attention were the cultural sensitivity guidelines. Page after page of carefully worded advice about interspecies interaction, dietary restrictions, religious observances, and behavioral expectations. There was even a section specifically about humans, written in the diplomatic language that characterized all official Confederation documents. Human cadets may exhibit behaviors that appear unusual or concerning to cadets from other worlds, one section read. This is typically due to their unique evolutionary background and should not be interpreted as aggressive or inappropriate. Human psychological resilience often manifests in ways that may seem surprising to other species. If you observe behavior that causes concern, please contact your section supervisor rather than attempting to address the situation directly. Sarah read that section twice, then found herself genuinely smiling for the first time since leaving Earth. The galaxy's military elite were apparently nervous about sharing their academy with humans. She wondered what kinds of incidents had prompted such carefully worded warnings. A soft chime indicated that her orientation session was about to begin. Sarah made her way to the designated assembly area, following her room's navigation system through corridors that grew progressively more crowded as other new cadets converged on the same destination. The assembly hall could have held a small city. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled seats arranged in complex patterns that accommodated different physiologies and social structures. Sarah found herself in a section with other humanoid species, surrounded by beings who looked almost familiar, but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who had never needed to fight for their daily survival. At the front of the hall, a figure approached the speaking platform with the kind of measured, commanding presence that spoke to decades of military leadership. Commander Vexhai was a Krillian, one of the bear-like species that served as the Confederation's primary ground forces. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with fur that showed the silver of age and scars that spoke to extensive combat experience, the commander embodied everything the Academy represented. "Cadets," Commander Vexhai began, his voice carrying easily through the vast space without technological amplification. "Welcome to the Kepler Military Academy. You are here because you represent the finest your worlds have to offer. You have been selected not just for your individual abilities, but for your potential to serve as bridges between your species and the greater galactic community." The commander's gaze swept across the assembled cadets, pausing briefly in Sarah's section. She wondered if he was looking at her specifically, or if she was imagining the attention. "The training you will receive here is designed to prepare you for leadership in an increasingly complex galaxy," the commander continued. "You will be challenged physically, intellectually, and emotionally. Some of you will discover strengths you never knew you possessed. Others will encounter limitations you must learn to overcome." A holographic display materialized above the platform, showing the Academy's organizational structure. Sarah noted that the training programs were divided by species capabilities rather than integrated mixed groups. A practical approach, but one that would limit interaction between different kinds of cadets. "Your first month will be devoted to baseline assessments and foundational training," Commander Vexhai explained. "During this period, you will be evaluated in all standard military disciplines. Based on these evaluations, you will be assigned to specialized tracks that match your aptitudes and your species' traditional strengths." Sarah found herself wondering what track humans would be assigned to. Earth had only been part of the Confederation for 37 years, which meant there wasn't much of a tradition to draw from. The few humans who had attended the Academy previously had apparently made enough of an impression to warrant those cultural sensitivity guidelines, but their specific achievements weren't mentioned in any of the materials she had reviewed. The orientation continued for another hour, covering practical details about Academy life, expectations for cadet behavior, and the academic standards that would govern their training. When it concluded, Sarah joined the flow of beings heading toward their assigned quarters, listening to conversations in dozens of languages as her fellow cadets discussed their impressions of the Academy and their expectations for the training ahead. Back in her quarters, Sarah reviewed the detailed schedule that had been uploaded to her personal system. Her first full day would begin with physical assessment, followed by academic testing, psychological evaluation, and an individual meeting with her assigned advisor. It was a comprehensive process designed to identify each cadet's strengths and weaknesses, providing the foundation for personalized training programs. She was looking forward to it. That night, as the Academy's artificial day cycle shifted toward evening, Sarah stood at her quarters viewport and looked out at the stars. Somewhere in that vast expanse was Earth, the world that had forged her into someone who could look at military training as an interesting challenge rather than a daunting obstacle. Tomorrow, the galaxy's most prestigious military academy would get its first real taste of what a Deathworld produced. Sarah suspected it would be an educational experience for everyone involved. The next morning arrived with a gentle chiming that served as the Academy's wake-up signal. Sarah had been awake for an hour already, having completed a workout routine that would have impressed her instructors back on Earth and worried her new classmates considerably. The physical assessment was scheduled to begin at the start of the Academy's day cycle, and she wanted to be fully prepared. The assessment facility was another marvel of engineering, with sections designed to test the physical capabilities of beings whose evolutionary background spanned everything from aquatic worlds to high-gravity mountain ranges. Sarah reported to the section designated for humanoid species, where she found herself among cadets whose physical forms were broadly similar to her own, but whose capabilities varied widely. The testing protocol was comprehensive and standardized, designed to evaluate strength, speed, endurance, coordination, and adaptability across a range of activities. Sarah watched as her fellow cadets worked through the various stations, noting the careful way they approached each challenge and the measured effort they applied to avoid overexertion. When her turn came, Sarah approached the first station with the calm focus that had become second nature during her years on Earth. The strength test involved lifting progressively heavier weights until reaching failure point, a straightforward assessment that would establish baseline capabilities for future training. The testing supervisor, a Centaurian whose 4 arms allowed him to monitor multiple data streams simultaneously, gestured toward the lifting apparatus. Begin with the weight marked as standard for your species, he instructed. Increase incrementally until you reach your maximum safe capacity. Sarah nodded and examined the weights. The standard marking for humans was considerably lower than what she had been lifting during her morning workout, but she understood the careful approach the Academy took to cadet safety. She began with the designated weight and worked her way up the scale, lifting each increment with the same control form she had learned from instructors who considered proper technique a matter of life and death. As the weights increased, Sarah noticed that other cadets had stopped their own testing to watch. The Centaurian supervisor's 4 hands moved constantly across his monitoring equipment, recording data with an efficiency that spoke to years of experience. When Sarah reached the weight level that had caused most of her fellow humanoids to reach failure, she was just beginning to feel properly warmed up. "Continue," the supervisor said, his voice carrying a note of professional interest. Sarah continued. The weights kept increasing, and her form remained perfectly controlled. She had learned to lift under conditions where a moment of carelessness could result in injury that would prove fatal on a world where medical assistance was days away. The controlled environment of the Academy's testing facility felt almost luxuriously safe by comparison. When she finally reached her actual limit, the facility had grown quite quiet. Sarah set down the final weight with the same controlled motion she had used throughout the test and turned to the supervisor for her next station assignment. The Centaurian was staring at his monitoring equipment with the expression of someone whose instruments were reporting impossible data. That reading cannot be correct," he murmured, running a diagnostic check on his systems. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked politely. The supervisor's 4 hands moved across his controls, running the diagnostic sequence again. "The equipment is functioning properly," he said slowly. "According to these readings, you just lifted approximately 4 times the expected capacity for your species body weight ratio." Sarah considered this. Should I repeat the test? The question seemed to break the supervisor out of his confusion. No, that won't be necessary. Please proceed to the next station." The speed and agility testing produced similar results. Sarah moved through the obstacle course with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate terrain where a single misstep could be fatal. Her reaction times fell well outside the normal range for humanoid species, and her coordination score suggested muscle memory trained under conditions that required split-second decision-making as a matter of routine. By the time she reached the endurance station, word had apparently spread. Sarah noticed Academy staff members appearing at various observation points around the facility, their attention focused on her performance with the kind of professional interest that suggested this was not a routine assessment. The endurance test was designed as a graduated challenge that would push cadets to their sustainable limits without risking injury. Sarah settled into the steady rhythm that had carried her through countless long journeys across Earth's hostile landscapes, maintaining a pace that felt comfortable while the monitoring equipment recorded her cardiovascular response and metabolic efficiency. An hour later, when most cadets would have been approaching exhaustion, Sarah was still maintaining her initial pace with no signs of distress. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing was controlled, and her form showed no deterioration. The testing supervisor had been joined by 2 colleagues, all of whom were studying their monitoring equipment with expressions of growing bewilderment. After 2 hours, the supervisor approached Sarah with the cautious manner of someone dealing with a situation outside normal parameters. "Cadet Chun," he said carefully, "how are you feeling?" "Fine," Sarah replied, maintaining her pace. "Should I continue?" The supervisor exchanged glances with his colleagues. "How much longer do you estimate you could maintain this level of activity?" Sarah considered the question. "As long as necessary, sir. This is a fairly comfortable pace." The 3 supervisors held a brief consultation in a language Sarah didn't recognize, then returned their attention to her. "That will be sufficient for today's assessment," the primary supervisor said. "Please proceed to the recovery area and await your next assignment." As Sarah made her way to the designated area, she became aware of the attention she was drawing from other cadets and staff members throughout the facility. Conversations had grown quiet, and she could feel the weight of dozens of gazes following her movement. It was a familiar sensation. She had experienced similar reactions during her time in Earth's military training programs, where instructors struggled to develop programs that could challenge students who had been forged by a world that treated survival as a daily achievement. The recovery area was designed to help cadets transition safely from high-intensity activity back to normal function. Sarah accepted the offered refreshments and settled into one of the comfortable seats, noting that the other cadets in the area were giving her a respectful distance. Their conversations, when they resumed, were conducted in lowered voices that suggested she had become a topic of considerable interest. A few minutes later, one of the testing supervisors approached with a datapad and the careful manner of someone delivering news that might be poorly received. "Cadet Chun," he said formally, "your assessment results are being forwarded to your academic advisor for review. You should expect to receive a meeting schedule within the next few hours." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, sir. Is there anything else needed from me today?" The supervisor glanced at his datapad, then back at her. "Not at this time. You may consider yourself free until your advisor meeting is scheduled." As Sarah left the assessment facility, she was aware that her first day at the academy had created something of a stir. The carefully controlled environment that accommodated hundreds of different species had encountered something that didn't fit neatly into any of its established categories. She suspected that tomorrow would be even more interesting. The meeting with academic advisor Zilnara took place in an office that perfectly embodied the Academy's commitment to multicultural accommodation. The space could adjust its atmospheric composition, gravitational field, and lighting spectrum to suit the needs of any species in the Confederation. When Sarah arrived, it was configured for what the Academy's systems had determined were optimal human environmental preferences. Advisor Zilnara was Avet Hani, one of the crystalline species renowned throughout the galaxy for their analytical capabilities and their role as the Confederation's primary academic administrators. Her form was roughly humanoid, but composed of what appeared to be living crystal, with light patterns that pulsed and shifted through her translucent structure as she processed information. When Sarah entered, those patterns accelerated noticeably. "Please sit," Zilnara said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that characterized Vethani communication. "I have been reviewing your assessment results, and I must admit they present some interesting challenges from a curriculum development perspective." Sarah settled into the offered chair, noting that it adjusted automatically to provide optimal support for human physiology. "Is there a problem with the results?" "Not a problem, exactly," Zilnara replied, light patterns shifting through her crystalline form as she accessed data from multiple sources simultaneously. Rather, they fall significantly outside the parameters we use for standard track assignment. Your physical capabilities exceed the established ranges for humanoid species by margins that our systems initially flagged as measurement errors. The advisor gestured, and holographic displays materialized in the air between them, showing comparative data across multiple species and assessment categories. Sarah's results appeared as bright markers that fell well beyond the normal distribution curves for nearly every measured attribute. Additionally, Zelnara continued, your academic assessments indicate cognitive processing patterns that are unusual, not inferior or superior, necessarily, but structured in ways that suggest radically different problem-solving approaches from what we typically encounter. Sarah studied the data displays with interest. Her scores were indeed outliers, but not in ways that seemed problematic from her perspective. What does this mean for my training assignment? The light patterns in Zelnara's form shifted to what Sarah was beginning to recognize as the Vethani equivalent of uncertainty. Typically, cadets are assigned to training tracks based on their species' traditional strengths and their individual capabilities within normal ranges. Your results suggest capabilities that span multiple specializations simultaneously. Is that unusual? Extremely so, Zelnara admitted. Most species have evolved specialized advantages that make them particularly suited for specific military roles. The Krillians excel at ground combat due to their physical strength and natural resilience. The Altarians serve as exceptional pilots because of their enhanced spatial awareness and reaction capabilities. The Xantharans make ideal intelligence operatives due to their natural camouflage abilities and analytical skills. She paused, studying Sarah with the focused attention of someone encountering a fascinating puzzle. Humans appear to be generalists rather than specialists. Your species shows competence across multiple areas without the extreme specialization we see in others. From a military perspective, this presents both opportunities and challenges. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Where do generalists typically get assigned? That's precisely the question we're grappling with, Zelnara replied. Command track typically requires proven expertise in at least one specialized area before cadets can develop the broader perspectives needed for leadership roles. Your assessment results suggest you might be capable of command track preparation, but without the traditional prerequisite specialization. The advisor made a gesture that caused new data to appear in the holographic display. I've consulted with the Academy's leadership, and we've decided to assign you to an experimental track. You'll rotate through multiple specializations during your first year, allowing us to better understand how your capabilities might best be developed. That sounds interesting, Sarah said, and meant it. The prospect of exposure to multiple military disciplines appealed to her natural curiosity about how different species approach the challenges of organized conflict. I should warn you, Zelnara added, her light patterns shifting toward what Sarah interpreted as concern, that some of your instructors may find your training approach challenging. Many of our faculty have centuries of experience with species whose capabilities and learning styles are well established. You may encounter resistance or skepticism as they adapt to working with someone whose background is so different from what they're accustomed to. Sarah considered this. Her experience with Earth's military training had taught her that instructors often had strong opinions about proper methods and acceptable limits. She suspected that galactic military tradition would be even more deeply entrenched. Understand, she said. I'll do my best to adapt to their expectations. Zelnara's form brightened with what Sarah hoped was approval. Excellent. Your first rotation begins tomorrow with physical combat instruction under Sergeant Major Korvac. He's a Krillian with extensive combat experience and a reputation for maintaining extremely high standards. The next morning, Sarah reported to Physical Combat Training Complex Delta, a massive facility designed to accommodate the training needs of species whose idea of hand-to-hand combat could involve anything from delicate precision strikes to battles between beings who mass several tons each. The section she was assigned to was configured for what the Academy classified as medium-mass humanoid combat training. The space resembled a traditional martial arts dojo, scaled up to accommodate beings significantly larger than humans, with training surfaces designed to absorb impacts that would be devastating in normal environments. Sergeant Major Korvac stood at the center of the training area like a monument to controlled violence. Even by Krillian standards, he was massive, nearly 4 meters tall, with muscle mass that suggested he could probably lift a shuttle without mechanical assistance. His fur was silver gray with age, and his visible scars spoke to decades of combat experience across multiple theaters of operation. Sarah joined the formation of cadets, arranging themselves in neat ranks before the instructor. Her fellow students were drawn from various humanoid species, all of whom carried themselves with the careful confidence of beings who had been taught that violence was something to be approached with proper respect and preparation. Today we begin your education in the principles of close combat, Korvac announced, his voice carrying easily through the large space despite speaking at what seemed to be normal conversational volume. Combat is not about aggression or anger. It is about the controlled application of force to achieve specific objectives. The instructor began walking among the assembled cadets, his massive form moving with surprising grace. The species represented in this class have different natural capabilities and different cultural approaches to combat. My role is to help each of you develop techniques that work with your particular strengths while addressing your species-specific limitations. His gaze paused on Sarah with the focused attention of a professional evaluating new equipment. Some of you come from worlds where combat is a theoretical concept, something your species has moved beyond as civilization advanced. Others come from worlds where combat remains a necessary skill for survival. Sarah felt the attention of her fellow cadets shift toward her as Korvac's meaning became clear. She maintained the neutral expression that had served her well during countless evaluations and assessments. The Academy's records indicate that humans come from what the Confederation classifies as a Class 12 Deathworld, Korvac continued, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing a potentially sensitive topic. This suggests a background of regular exposure to life-threatening situations. He moved to stand directly in front of Sarah, studying her with the analytical attention of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating potential opponents. Cadet Shun, what is your experience with formal combat training? I completed basic training with Earth's Unified Military Forces, sir, Sarah replied. The program included hand-to-hand combat instruction, though it focused primarily on survival techniques rather than formal martial arts. Korvac's expression suggested he was processing implications beyond what her words explicitly conveyed. Demonstrate your basic ready stance. Sarah shifted into the balanced position that had been drilled into her during months of training under instructors who considered proper form a matter of life and death. Her weight was evenly distributed, her hands positioned for either offensive or defensive action, her body alignment optimized for rapid movement in any direction. The instructor studied her stance with professional interest, walking around her to examine her form from multiple angles. Adjust your foot position, he said after a moment. Spread your base wider for better stability. Sarah made the adjustment, though it felt less natural than her original position. On Earth, combat training had emphasized mobility over stability, the ability to move quickly across uncertain terrain rather than holding defensive positions. Better, Korvac said. Now, we will practice basic striking techniques. Partner with Cadet Veltar for the initial exercises. Cadet Veltar was an Altarian, roughly Sarah's height, but built with the lightweight bone structure that had evolved on a world with lower gravity than Earth's. His movements were graceful and precise, reflecting the natural coordination that made his species exceptional pilots and technical specialists. The first exercise involves controlled striking, Korvac announced to the class. You will practice basic punching techniques against training targets, focusing on form rather than power. Remember, the goal is to develop proper mechanics that can be applied safely in training environments. Sarah approached the exercise with the same methodical attention she had applied to all her assessment activities. The training targets were designed to absorb impacts from species with a wide range of physical capabilities, automatically adjusting their resistance based on the user's measured strength. Her first strike landed with a solid impact that resonated through the training area. The target's feedback system registered the force and automatically adjusted for subsequent strikes, but the sound drew attention from other cadets and the instructor. "Excessive force, Cadet Chun," Korvac called out. "Remember, this is about technique development, not power demonstration." Sarah nodded and reduced her effort level, delivering strikes that felt almost ridiculously gentle by the standards of her Earth training. The other cadets resumed their own practice, though she noticed several continuing to glance in her direction. As the session progressed, Sarah found herself consistently having to hold back to avoid exceeding the exercise parameters. The training protocols were designed for species that had evolved away from regular physical conflict, beings whose natural strength and speed fell within ranges that made controlled practice possible without constant risk of injury. For someone who had learned combat techniques under conditions where holding back could prove fatal, the Academy's approach felt almost surreal in its careful restraint. "Partner sparring," Korvac announced after an hour of individual technique practice. "Light contact only. The objective is to practice defensive positioning and movement patterns, not to achieve victory over your opponent." Sarah partnered with Veltar again, appreciating the Altarian's graceful movement style and professional approach to the exercise. They began with the careful, controlled exchanges that characterized Academy sparring, precise techniques delivered with just enough force to demonstrate proper form without risking injury. It was during these exchanges that the fundamental problem became apparent. Veltar's movements, while technically excellent, were telegraphed well in advance by the standards Sarah had learned on Earth. His strikes followed the classical patterns taught in Academy curricula, delivered with the measured timing that allowed partners to respond appropriately without being caught off guard. Sarah found herself automatically responding with the defensive reactions that had been drilled into her during months of training against opponents who were genuinely trying to overwhelm her defenses. Her blocks and counters came with the speed and precision of someone who had learned that combat was about life and death rather than educational demonstration. The result was that Veltar found himself consistently unable to complete his planned techniques, his strikes being intercepted and redirected with the efficiency that left him struggling to maintain his balance and defensive position. "Hold," Korvac called out, approaching their training area with the focused attention of someone observing an unexpected development. "Cadet Chun, you're moving too aggressively for partner practice. Remember, the objective is mutual learning, not defeating your partner." Sarah stepped back and adopted a neutral stance. "I apologize, sir. I'll adjust my response level." But adjusting proved more difficult than she had anticipated. Her defensive reactions had been trained under conditions where failure to respond with maximum efficiency could result in injury or death. The controlled environment of Academy sparring required her to actively suppress reflexes that had become as natural as breathing. The next exchange went even worse. In her effort to reduce her response intensity, Sarah found herself caught between her trained reactions and the Academy's expectations. The result was choppy, uncertain movement that left both partners struggling to maintain the rhythm of proper sparring. "Stop," Korvac commanded, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had recognized a training problem that required immediate attention. Cadet Chun stepped forward. Sarah complied, aware that the entire class had stopped their own practice to observe whatever was about to happen. Korvac studied her with the analytical expression of an instructor encountering a student whose background didn't fit into any of his established teaching categories. "Your defensive responses are too advanced for introductory partner work," he said after a moment. "At the same time, your attempts to reduce intensity are creating technical problems that could lead to injury." He paused, considering options. "For the remainder of today's session, you will practice individual techniques against training targets. Tomorrow, report to Advanced Combat Instruction with Master Chief Braylock. The dismissal was delivered in neutral tones, but Sarah understood the implications. She had been moved out of introductory training not because of poor performance, but because her capabilities were incompatible with the careful, controlled environment designed to teach combat to species that approach violence as an academic subject. As she worked through individual technique practice, Sarah was aware of the attention from her classmates and the instructor. Her situation had become what educators on Earth would have called a teaching moment, an unexpected development that highlighted important principles about training methods and student capabilities. When a session ended, Korvac approached her with the direct manner of a professional addressing a practical problem. "Cadet Chun," he said, "your background has given you reflexes and capabilities that exceed the parameters of standard academy training. This is not a criticism of your performance, but it does present challenges for integration into normal curricula." Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir. I'll adapt to whatever training approach works best." "The question," Korvac replied, "is whether our training approaches can adapt to work with you. Master Chief Braylock has experience with cadets whose capabilities fall outside normal ranges. Perhaps he can develop methods that challenge you appropriately while maintaining Academy safety standards." That evening, alone in her quarters, Sarah reviewed the day's events with the analytical mindset that had helped her navigate the countless challenges of growing up on Earth. The Academy's training methods were designed for species whose evolutionary backgrounds had not included regular life-or-death combat situations. They approached violence as a technical skill to be learned through careful practice, rather than as a survival necessity to be mastered through repeated exposure to genuine threat. She was beginning to understand why the cultural sensitivity guidelines had been necessary. Her presence in standard classes created disruptions not through any intention on her part, but simply by virtue of capabilities that had been forged under conditions the galaxy's other species couldn't really comprehend. The next morning brought new challenges and new opportunities to discover just how different a Deathworld education could be from galactic norms. Master Chief Braylock operated in a different facility entirely, one located in a section of the Academy that Sarah's orientation materials had mentioned only briefly. The Advanced Combat Training Complex was designed for cadets whose capabilities required specialized instruction methods, and the security protocols to access it were considerably more stringent than what she had encountered elsewhere in the Academy. The facility itself was a testament to the diverse nature of galactic military forces. Training areas were configured to accommodate everything from aquatic combat specialists to beings whose natural abilities included various forms of energy projection. The section Sarah was directed to was marked as Extreme Capability Humanoid Training, a designation that suggested she was not the only cadet whose background presented unique challenges. Master Chief Braylock was not what she had expected. Where Sergeant Major Korvac had been a monument to physical power, Braylock was compact and efficient, his movements carrying the fluid precision of someone who had learned that true combat capability came from skill rather than size. He was a Zinthari, one of the species known for their intelligence work and unconventional warfare capabilities. "Cadet Chun," he said as she approached, his voice carrying accents that suggested extensive experience with multiple languages and cultures. "I've reviewed your assessment data and discussed your situation with Sergeant Major Korvac. It seems we have an interesting challenge ahead of us." The training area was configured differently from what Sarah had experienced before. Instead of the carefully controlled environment designed for safe practice, this space had an almost practical feel, with equipment and obstacles that suggested training for real-world applications rather than academic exercises. "Tell me about your combat training on Earth," Braylock said, settling into a relaxed stance that somehow managed to project both casualness and readiness simultaneously. Sarah considered the question carefully. "It was focused on survival rather than sport or formal discipline, sir. The instructors emphasized adaptability and effectiveness over traditional techniques." "Describe the training environment." "Variable terrain, unpredictable conditions, real consequences for mistakes," Sarah replied. The goal was to prepare us for situations where following established procedures might not be sufficient for survival. Braylock nodded with what appeared to be understanding. Combat as necessity rather than art. Yes, sir. Show me. The command was delivered without preamble or explanation, but Sarah understood what was being asked. She shifted into the ready position that felt natural rather than academically correct, her body automatically adapting to the assessment of threats and opportunities that the training environment presented. Braylock moved with sudden speed, launching an attack that would have been prohibited in standard academy training due to its intensity and unpredictability. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive, her defensive actions flowing into counterattacks with the seamless efficiency that had been drilled into her through months of training against opponents who were genuinely trying to overwhelm her. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it ended with Braylock on the ground, his attack neutralized and his position compromised by techniques that prioritized effectiveness over academic form. Sarah immediately stepped back and offered assistance, her training having taught her that combat ended when threats were neutralized, not when opponents were defeated. Braylock accepted her help getting to his feet, brushing dust from his uniform with movements that suggested professional interest rather than wounded pride. Interesting, he said after a moment. Your defensive priorities are completely different from what we teach here. Sir, Academy training teaches combat as a controlled application of force with specific objectives and limitations, Braylock explained. Your training appears to have emphasized survival above all other considerations. Sarah nodded. Earth's military instructors taught us that the primary objective of any conflict is to go home alive. A perspective that has merit, Braylock agreed, but one that presents challenges in a military academy designed to prepare officers for leadership roles in organized forces. He gestured for her to follow him to a different section of the training area, where equipment was arranged for what appeared to be scenario-based exercises. Military leadership requires the ability to apply force selectively and proportionally, Braylock continued. Officers must be capable of achieving objectives while minimizing casualties, following engagement protocols, and maintaining unit cohesion under stress. Your training has given you excellent survival capabilities, but survival skills and military leadership skills are not always the same thing. The insight was delivered without criticism, but Sarah recognized the fundamental challenge it represented. Her education had been designed to produce individuals who could survive in hostile environments. The Academy's mission was to develop leaders who could command complex military operations while balancing multiple objectives and constraints. How do I bridge that gap, sir? She asked. Braylock's expression suggested approval of the question. That remains to be determined. You're the first human cadet whose capabilities have required specialized instruction at this level. We'll need to develop training methods that build on your existing skills, while teaching you the additional capabilities required for military leadership. He moved to activate a control panel that brought various training scenarios online. We'll start with exercises designed to help you understand proportional response and selective application of force. These skills will be essential if you're to serve effectively as an officer in integrated galactic forces. The scenarios that followed were unlike anything Sarah had encountered during her Earth training. Instead of focusing on personal survival, they required her to balance multiple objectives, neutralizing threats while minimizing damage, achieving tactical goals while preserving friendly forces, and maintaining mission focus while adapting to changing conditions. It was challenging in entirely new ways, requiring her to suppress her trained instincts for maximum effectiveness in favor of measured responses that served broader strategic objectives. As the session progressed, Sarah began to understand why her presence at the Academy had created such complications. Her capabilities weren't inadequate for military service. They were optimized for a different kind of military service than what the Confederation typically required. The realization that would define her entire Academy experience was slowly taking shape. She wasn't just learning to be a military officer. She was learning to be a bridge between two completely different approaches to organized conflict. 3 months into her academy training, Sarah had developed a reputation that followed her through every corridor and classroom. It wasn't the kind of reputation she had anticipated earning, not one built on academic excellence or leadership potential, though her scores in those areas were exemplary. Instead, she had become known as the cadet who had accidentally broken the Academy's training systems simply by being herself. The incident that would define the rest of her time at Kepler began during what should have been a routine tactical simulation exercise. The scenario was designed for advanced cadets, a complex multi-species operation that required coordination between different types of forces operating under combat conditions. Sarah had been assigned to the exercise as part of her experimental curriculum, the Academy's ongoing attempt to determine where humans' capabilities fit within established military doctrine. The simulation took place in one of the Academy's most sophisticated virtual reality complexes, a system capable of creating completely immersive environments that could challenge cadets from any species according to their specific physiological and psychological parameters. The technology was a masterwork of galactic engineering, refined over centuries to provide training experiences that were indistinguishable from reality while maintaining complete safety for participants. Sarah's team consisted of 12 cadets representing 7 different species, each assigned roles that matched their traditional military specializations. Krillian ground forces, Altarian pilots, Zenthari intelligence operatives, and others, all working together under the command structure that had served the Confederation's military forces for generations. The scenario itself was based on historical operations, a planetary liberation mission that required precise coordination between orbital support, ground assault forces, and specialized teams tasked with securing strategic objectives. It was the kind of complex operation that tested every aspect of military training and had been used successfully to evaluate thousands of cadets over the decades. Commander Vexai himself was observing this particular simulation, along with several other senior faculty members. Sarah's unconventional training path had generated considerable interest among the Academy's leadership, and they wanted to observe how she performed in integrated team operations. The exercise began smoothly. Sarah had been assigned to a special operations team tasked with disabling planetary defense systems ahead of the main assault. Her teammates were experienced cadets who had already completed standard specialization tracks, and they approached the mission with the methodical professionalism that characterized elite military units throughout the galaxy. The simulated environment was flawless in its realism. The team found themselves on the surface of a hostile world, facing defensive systems operated by enemies who responded with tactical intelligence and adaptive strategies. The sensory input was completely convincing. The feel of alien soil beneath their feet, the strange atmospheric conditions, the distant sounds of orbital bombardment as the main assault began. Sarah's role was designated as Adaptive Specialist, a position created specifically for her unique skill set. While her teammates pursued their assigned objectives using established protocols, she was meant to handle unexpected complications and provide solutions to problems that fell outside normal operational parameters. The first hour of the simulation proceeded exactly according to the training curriculum. The team advanced through hostile territory using proven tactics, overcame defensive positions with appropriate force application, and maintained communication with command elements as they progressed toward their primary objective. It was when they encountered the first major complication that Sarah's different background became apparent. The team found their planned route blocked by a defensive emplacement that hadn't appeared in their initial intelligence briefing. The position was heavily fortified and occupied by enemies equipped with weapons that could easily destroy the team if they attempted a frontal assault. According to established tactical doctrine, the appropriate response was to call for additional support, establish a perimeter, and wait for either reinforcement or alternative orders from command. Sarah's teammates immediately began implementing the correct response procedures. They established communication with command elements, requested tactical support, and prepared defensive positions while awaiting instructions. Sarah studied the situation with the analytical approach that had been trained into her during years of navigating environments where waiting for help was not an option. The defensive position was formidable by conventional standards, but she could see vulnerabilities that her teammates had not identified, approaches that would be impossible for most species, but well within human capabilities. "I can get around their position," she told the team leader, a Krillian named Thurvek who had demonstrated excellent leadership potential throughout their training. Thurvek studied the terrain she was indicating with the careful analysis that characterized his species' approach to military operations. "That approach angle is unsuitable for our operational parameters," he said after a moment. "The terrain is too unstable for safe traverse." Sarah looked again at the route she had identified. The path required movement across broken ground that would challenge most species' mobility capabilities, but she had grown up navigating terrain far more treacherous as a matter of daily routine. "I can make it alone," she suggested. "Once I'm in position, I can neutralize their heavy weapons and clear the way for the team." The response from her teammates was immediate and unanimous. Absolutely not. Military doctrine prohibited lone operations in hostile territory, except under the most extreme circumstances. Team cohesion was fundamental to Confederation military philosophy, and individual action outside command authority was one of the most serious violations possible. "We wait for support," Thurvek decided firmly. "No one operates alone." Sarah accepted the decision with the professional courtesy that had been drilled into her during months of learning to work within galactic military culture. But as the minutes passed and their situation remained unchanged, she found herself growing restless in ways that her teammates couldn't understand. On Earth, waiting in a defensive position while enemies prepared countermeasures was often equivalent to choosing defeat. The hostile environment rewarded aggressive action and punished hesitation with consequences that extended far beyond mission failure. Sarah's training had emphasized seizing initiative and creating opportunities rather than waiting for ideal conditions that might never arrive. 20 minutes into what was becoming a prolonged standoff, Sarah made a decision that would have profound consequences for the rest of her academy experience. She moved. The route she had identified required capabilities that fell well outside the normal parameters for humanoid species. The terrain was loose, unstable, and would have been impassable for any of her teammates. But Sarah had learned to move across surfaces that would challenge the stability of mechanical vehicles, and the simulated environment's treacherous ground felt almost comfortable by comparison. Her movement was detected immediately by her teammates' monitoring systems, but by the time they realized what she was attempting, she had already progressed too far for recall to be practical. Thurvek's attempts to order her back were hampered by the need to maintain communication security, and Sarah was rapidly moving beyond reliable radio range. The simulation's artificial intelligence, designed to provide realistic opposition, responded to her unexpected approach with tactical adaptations that reflected genuine military thinking. Enemy forces repositioned to counter the new threat, but their responses were based on normal humanoid movement capabilities and reaction times. Sarah moved through the hostile environment with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned navigation techniques on a world where hesitation was often fatal. She avoided defensive sensors using natural camouflage and terrain masking, approached the enemy position from angles they had not prepared for, and neutralized their heavy weapons with precision strikes that eliminated threats without creating unnecessary casualties. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes from initiation to completion. When she signaled the all clear to her teammates, the silence that followed was profound and extended. Through her communication equipment, she could hear background conversations that suggested the observing faculty members were engaged in intense discussion. Thurvek's voice, when it finally came, carried tones that Sarah had never heard from him before. "Cadet Chun, return to team position immediately." The remainder of the simulation proceeded without incident, but Sarah was aware that something fundamental had changed in her relationships with both her teammates and the Academy's faculty. The successful completion of their mission objectives had been overshadowed by her violation of established procedures and command authority. When the simulation ended, the 12 team members found themselves in a debriefing room facing a panel of instructors whose expressions ranged from professional concern to outright bewilderment. Commander Vexhai sat at the center of the panel, his massive form radiating the kind of controlled authority that suggested serious consequences were being considered. The mission objectives were achieved within acceptable time frames and with minimal simulated casualties. Commander Vexhai began, his voice carrying the neutral tones that preceded difficult conversations. However, the methods employed raise significant concerns about adherence to military protocol and chain of command. His gaze focused on Sarah with the intensity of someone delivering a formal reprimand. Cadet Chun, your unauthorized solo operation violated multiple fundamental principles of Confederation military doctrine. Explain your reasoning. Sarah stood and adopted the formal posture required for official responses to superior officers. Sir, the team's position was becoming untenable. Standard procedures would have resulted in either mission failure or unacceptable casualties. I identified an opportunity to resolve the situation with minimal risk. Minimal risk to whom? Commander Vexhai asked, his tone carrying implications that Sarah was beginning to understand. To the mission and to my teammates, sir. And the risk to yourself? Sarah considered the question carefully. From her perspective, the route she had taken and the action she had performed fell well within acceptable risk parameters by the standards of her Earth training. But she was beginning to realize that acceptable risk had very different definitions depending on one's background. I assessed the risk as manageable, sir. The panel exchanged glances that conveyed layers of meaning beyond what Sarah could decipher. Commander Vexhai leaned forward slightly, his expression suggesting that important decisions were being weighed. Cadet Chun, in Confederation military forces, individual safety is not subordinate to mission objectives. Officers are expected to preserve their forces, including themselves, while achieving strategic goals. Your approach prioritized mission success over personal safety in ways that violate fundamental principles of our military philosophy. Sarah felt the weight of cultural differences that went far deeper than she had previously understood. Her education had taught her that mission success often required accepting personal risk that others would consider unacceptable. The galaxy's military tradition apparently operated from completely different assumptions about the relationship between individual welfare and collective objectives. I understand, sir, she replied, though she suspected her understanding was still incomplete. Do you? Commander Vexhai asked. Because this is not the first time your training approach has created complications. Your performance in physical training has required specialized instruction because your capabilities exceed safety parameters. Your combat training has had to be separated from standard curricula because your reflexes are incompatible with controlled learning environments. Now your tactical judgment appears to operate from risk assessment models that are fundamentally different from established military doctrine. The commander paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. The question we face is whether these differences can be reconciled with the requirements of service as an officer in Confederation forces. Sarah remained at attention, but she was beginning to understand that her future at the academy was being decided in this moment. The experimental training program, designed to accommodate her unique background, had encountered limitations that might prove insurmountable. However, Commander Vexhai continued, your tactical solution was effective, innovative, and achieved mission objectives with results that exceeded simulation parameters. The artificial intelligence systems rated your approach as tactically sound despite its violations of standard procedure. That was unexpected. Sarah risked a glance at the other panel members and noticed that their expressions had shifted from concern toward something that looked more like professional interest. This presents us with a dilemma, the commander continued. Military discipline requires adherence to established procedures and chain of command. But military effectiveness also requires the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances and develop innovative solutions to tactical challenges. He stood, his massive form commanding attention from everyone in the room. Your unauthorized action was a clear violation of military protocol that would normally result in formal discipline. At the same time, your tactical innovation demonstrated capabilities that could prove valuable in operational environments where standard procedures prove insufficient. Sarah waited for the resolution of what appeared to be a fundamental contradiction in military philosophy. "You will repeat this simulation," Commander Vexai announced. "This time, you'll be designated as team leader, with authority to make tactical decisions and coordinate team actions. We will observe whether your approach to risk and innovation can be integrated with command responsibility and team coordination." The decision surprised everyone in the room, including Sarah herself. Being designated as team leader was typically a privilege reserved for cadets who had demonstrated exceptional performance in standard curricula and proven themselves capable of working within established military frameworks. "Sir," Thurvek interjected, his voice carrying the careful respect due to superior officers combined with obvious concern. "Cadet Chun lacks the standard leadership training prerequisites." "Correct," Commander Vexai agreed, "which is why this will be an interesting test of whether leadership capabilities can emerge from unconventional backgrounds." He turned his attention back to Sarah. "You will have 48 hours to prepare. During that time, you will review Confederation leadership doctrine and work with your team members to develop approaches that integrate your tactical capabilities with their specializations. The simulation will be configured to present challenges that require both innovative problem-solving and adherence to military protocol." As the debriefing concluded and the team members began filing out of the room, Sarah realized that her situation at the academy had shifted in ways she was still trying to understand. Instead of being disciplined for violating procedures, she had been given an opportunity to demonstrate whether her different approach to military challenges could be developed into effective leadership. The 48 hours that followed were unlike anything she had experienced during her time at the academy. Instead of attending standard classes, she found herself immersed in intensive study of Confederation military doctrine, leadership principles, and command procedures. The material was comprehensive and detailed, representing centuries of refined military philosophy developed across dozens of species and thousands of operational environments. More challenging than the academic material was working with her team members to develop integrated approaches that combine their specialized capabilities with their unconventional problem-solving methods. The other cadets had accepted her appointment as team leader with professional courtesy, but she could sense their underlying concerns about serving under someone whose training background was so different from their own. Thurvek, in particular, struggled with the role reversal. As a Krillian, his species had produced military leaders for the Confederation for over 3 centuries. His training had been comprehensive and traditional, emphasizing proven methods and established doctrine. Taking direction from someone whose approach seemed to violate fundamental military principles required adjustments that went against his deepest instincts. "I don't question your tactical capabilities," he told Sarah during one of their planning sessions. "Your solution to the defensive emplacement was effective and innovative. But leadership involves more than individual tactical excellence. It requires the ability to coordinate team actions, maintain unit cohesion, and make decisions that balance multiple objectives simultaneously." Sarah understood his concerns and recognized that they reflected genuine military wisdom rather than species prejudice. Command responsibility was fundamentally different from individual performance, requiring skills that her Earth training had touched on only briefly. "What would you have done differently?" she asked, genuinely seeking his perspective. Thurvek considered the question with a methodical analysis that characterized his approach to all military problems. "I would have maintained team unity while seeking alternative solutions, perhaps requesting orbital bombardment to eliminate the defensive position, or coordinating with other teams to develop a combined approach that didn't require individual risk. What if those alternatives weren't available? Then I would have waited for them to become available or withdrawn to reevaluate mission parameters. Sarah realized that their disagreement reflected fundamentally different approaches to acceptable outcomes. Thurvek's training emphasized preserving forces and achieving objectives through coordination and support. Her training emphasized achieving objectives regardless of available support, accepting individual risk to prevent collective failure. How do we combine those approaches? She asked. The question led to hours of discussion that gradually developed into something resembling a unified tactical philosophy. Sarah's team members had specialized capabilities that could be leveraged in ways that reduced the need for individual risk-taking. Her unconventional problem-solving could identify opportunities that standard doctrine might overlook. The combination had potential that neither approach could achieve alone. When the simulation exercise resumed, Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar position of coordinating team actions rather than operating as an individual specialist. The same virtual environment, the same tactical challenges, but approached from an entirely different perspective. The defensive emplacement that had triggered her unauthorized action in the previous simulation appeared on schedule, blocking the team's advance with heavy weapons that made frontal assault impractical. This time, instead of identifying a personal solution, Sarah worked with her team members to develop a coordinated approach that utilized everyone's capabilities. Altaria mobility specialists identified approach routes that were suitable for the team rather than just for human physiology. Zenthari intelligence operatives provided real-time analysis of enemy response patterns. Krillian ground forces prepared to exploit opportunities created by other team members' actions. When Sarah moved to neutralize the defensive position, she did so as part of a coordinated operation rather than an individual initiative. Her teammates provided overwatch, communication relay, and immediate support for withdrawal if the situation deteriorated. The enemy position was neutralized with the same effectiveness as before, but through team action rather than solo operation. The simulation continued for 4 hours, presenting challenge after challenge that required the team to adapt their approaches while maintaining coordination and command structure. Sarah found herself learning to balance her instinctive responses with the requirements of leadership, to make decisions that considered team capabilities and limitations rather than just individual opportunities. When the exercise concluded, she realized that something had fundamentally changed in her understanding of military service. Her Earth training had prepared her to survive and succeed as an individual operating in hostile environments. The Academy was teaching her to lead others who shared those challenges, to coordinate capabilities rather than just deploy them. The debriefing that followed was markedly different from the previous session. The same panel of instructors, the same formal setting, but the atmosphere was one of professional evaluation rather than disciplinary review. Mission objectives achieved within acceptable parameters, Commander Vexhai announced. Team cohesion maintained throughout the exercise. Command decisions demonstrated integration of innovative tactical approaches with established military doctrine. He paused, studying Sarah with the expression of someone reaching important conclusions. Cadet Chun, your performance as team leader suggests that your unconventional background can be developed into effective command capability. Your ability to coordinate diverse, specialist capabilities while maintaining tactical innovation shows promise for future leadership roles. That was when Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Earth. The deep satisfaction of meeting a challenge that pushed her capabilities to their limits while contributing to something larger than individual survival. But it was also when she made the mistake that would define her reputation for the remainder of her time at the Academy. She laughed, not mockingly or dismissively, but with genuine pleasure at having successfully navigated a complex challenge. It was the kind of laughter that came from someone who had learned to find joy in overcoming obstacles that others considered overwhelming. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Commander Vexhai's expression shifted through several stages of surprise, confusion, and what Sarah would later recognize as the beginning of a fundamental reassessment of everything he thought he understood about human psychology. Cadet Chun, he said slowly. "You find military command amusing?" Sarah realized immediately that her response had been misinterpreted, but understanding the mistake and correcting it proved to be different challenges entirely. "No, sir," she replied. "I was expressing satisfaction at successfully completing a difficult challenge." "Through laughter?" "Yes, sir." The panel members exchanged glances that conveyed layers of meaning Sarah was only beginning to comprehend. In Confederation military tradition, command responsibility was approached with the gravity appropriate to decisions that affected the lives of others. Laughter in the context of military operations was associated with either disrespect for authority or psychological instability. Cadet Chun, Commander Vexhai, continued, "Please explain why you consider command responsibility a source of amusement." And that was when Sarah realized that her cultural translation problems went far deeper than anyone at the academy had anticipated. Her laughter hadn't been about finding command amusing. It had been an expression of the joy that came from successfully meeting challenges that pushed her capabilities to their limits. On Earth, that kind of laughter was understood as a natural response to surviving difficulties that tested one's abilities. In galactic military culture, it was apparently interpreted as evidence of inappropriate attitudes towards serious responsibilities. Her attempt to explain only made things worse. The aftermath of Sarah's laughter created ripples that spread throughout the academy with the inexorable force of a seismic event. Within hours, every instructor, administrator, and senior cadet had heard about the human who had laughed during a formal military evaluation. The story grew with each telling, until it became the kind of legend that would be discussed in hushed tones for years after Sarah's graduation. Commander Vexhai had not smiled since that moment in the debriefing room. The reaction had been immediate and visceral, a fundamental shift in his demeanor that spoke to psychological impacts far beyond simple professional disapproval. The laughter had triggered something in the Krillians' understanding of proper military behavior that ran deeper than doctrine or training protocols. Sarah found herself summoned to a series of meetings with Academy personnel she had never encountered before: psychological evaluators, cultural specialists, and senior administrators who approached her case with a careful attention reserved for unprecedented situations. Each interview followed similar patterns, with officials attempting to understand whether her response indicated psychological instability, cultural misunderstanding, or something else entirely. "Explain again why you laughed," Dr. Thimalera requested during their third session. The Vethani psychologist's crystalline form pulsed with patterns that Sarah had learned indicated intense analytical activity. "It was an expression of satisfaction," Sarah replied, maintaining the patient tone that had served her through dozens of similar conversations. On Earth, laughter often indicates pleasure at successfully overcoming challenges. But the challenge was military command, Dr. Thimalera pointed out. Command responsibility involves decisions that affect the lives of sentient beings. In what context would such responsibility be considered pleasurable? Sarah realized that each attempt to explain her cultural background was actually making her situation worse. The gap between human psychological responses and galactic norms was apparently wider than anyone had anticipated. "It wasn't the responsibility I found pleasurable," she tried to clarify. "It was the successful completion of a difficult task that required new skills and approaches." The psychologist's light patterns shifted toward what Sarah was learning to recognize as concern. "Cadet Chun, do you understand the gravity of military leadership? The lives that depend on command decisions? The consequences of tactical mistakes?" "Yes, I understand those things." "And that understanding generates pleasure for you?" The conversation had entered circular territory that Sarah couldn't navigate successfully. Every explanation she offered seemed to reinforce the impression that her psychological responses were incompatible with military responsibility. Word of the sessions spread through academy networks with the efficiency that characterized all gossip in closed communities. Sarah's fellow cadets began treating her with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and careful distance that suggested her reputation had evolved into something genuinely problematic. Thurvek approached her after their next team training session with a direct manner that characterized Krillian communication. "Chin, what did you do to Commander Vex-High?" "What do you mean? He hasn't been the same since your evaluation. Other instructors are saying he's requested reassignment away from human training programs. Some are saying he's considering early retirement." Sarah felt the weight of unintended consequences settling onto her shoulders. Commander Vex-High's reaction to her laughter had apparently created problems that extended far beyond her own academic standing. "I didn't mean to cause problems for anyone," she said honestly. "I believe that," Thurvek replied. "But intention and impact are different things. Whatever happened in that debriefing room, it affected him profoundly." That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have significant consequences for the remainder of her academy experience. She requested a formal meeting with Commander Vex-High, hoping to address whatever damage her cultural misunderstanding had created. The meeting was scheduled for the following day in the commander's office, a space that reflected the practical efficiency characteristic of senior Krillian military officers. The walls displayed commendations and unit citations from decades of distinguished service, creating an atmosphere that emphasized the weight of military tradition and responsibility. Commander Vex-High received her with formal courtesy, but Sarah could see the fundamental change in his demeanor that Thurvek had mentioned. The easy authority and confident presence she had observed during her first weeks at the academy had been replaced by something more guarded and uncertain. "Cadet Chun," he said without preamble, "explain to me why someone would laugh at the prospect of holding other beings' lives in their hands." The question was delivered with a directness that suggested it had been weighing on his mind since their previous encounter. Sarah realized that her laughter had created a crisis of understanding that went far deeper than simple cultural confusion. "Sir, I wasn't laughing at the responsibility," she began, but he interrupted with a gesture that indicated he had heard similar explanations before. "Then, what were you laughing at?" Sarah took a breath and tried a different approach. "Commander, on Earth, we laugh for many reasons. Sometimes it's humor, sometimes it's pleasure, sometimes it's relief. In that moment, I was experiencing what my people call the joy of achievement, the satisfaction that comes from successfully meeting a challenge that pushed my capabilities." Commander Vex-High studied her with the intense focus of someone trying to comprehend concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions. "You experienced joy at being given responsibility for others' lives. I experienced joy at demonstrating that I could handle that responsibility effectively." The distinction seemed to create even more confusion rather than clarification. The commander leaned back in his chair, his massive form somehow diminished by uncertainty. "Cadet Chun, in 37 years of military service, I have never encountered psychological responses like yours. Military command is a burden to be accepted with gravity and carried with honor. It is not a source of pleasure or satisfaction. It is a responsibility that weighs on those who bear it, that requires sacrifice of personal desires for the welfare of those under command." Sarah began to understand the depth of the cultural chasm she had inadvertently revealed. Galactic military tradition approached command as a solemn duty, something to be accepted with resignation and executed with careful responsibility. Her expression of joy at receiving such responsibility had violated assumptions so fundamental that it called into question everything the commander believed about proper military psychology. "Sir," she said carefully, "what if both approaches can coexist? What if taking pleasure in meeting challenges makes someone more effective at handling responsibility rather than less?" The question seemed to strike at the heart of the commander's confusion. He stood and moved to the wall display showing his unit citations and service commendations, studying them as if seeking answers in his own professional history. "Throughout my career," he said slowly, "I have served with beings from dozens of species, each bringing their own cultural perspectives to military service. But all of them understood that command responsibility required putting aside personal satisfaction in favor of duty to others. He turned back to face Sarah, his expression carrying the weight of professional experiences that spanned decades. Your approach suggests that personal satisfaction and duty to others can be the same thing. This challenges fundamental principles that have guided Confederation military forces for centuries. Sarah realized that the conversation had moved beyond her individual situation to questions about military philosophy and cultural integration that affected the entire Academy's mission. "Is that necessarily a problem, sir?" she asked. The question seemed to surprise him. It could be. Military effectiveness depends on predictable responses from officers under stress. If human psychological patterns are fundamentally different from established norms, it could create coordination problems in integrated commands. Or, Sarah suggested, it could create new capabilities that enhance overall effectiveness. Commander Vexhai returned to his chair, his movements reflecting the careful consideration of someone weighing complex alternatives. "That possibility has been discussed among the Academy's leadership," he admitted. "Your tactical innovations during simulation exercises have demonstrated potential benefits of unconventional approaches. But your psychological responses suggest fundamental differences that go beyond tactical creativity." He paused, studying her with renewed focus. "The question we face is whether the potential benefits justify the risks of integrating officers whose psychological patterns we don't fully understand." Sarah realized that her future at the Academy, and possibly the future of human participation in Confederation military forces, was being decided through this conversation. "What would you need to understand, sir?" "How human psychological responses translate to performance under actual combat conditions," he replied immediately. "Whether your capacity for finding satisfaction in challenging situations enhances or compromises your ability to make difficult command decisions." The conversation was interrupted by an alert tone from the commander's communication system, followed by an announcement that caught both of their attention immediately. "All senior staff to Emergency Command Center. Code 7 protocols are now in effect." Commander Vexhai's demeanor shifted instantly from thoughtful reflection to focused professionalism. Code 7 indicated actual military situations requiring Academy response, not training exercises or simulation scenarios, but real operational requirements. "Cadet Chun," he said, standing and moving toward the door, "you're dismissed. Return to your quarters and await further instructions." But as they left his office and moved through corridors filled with Academy personnel responding to emergency protocols, Sarah found herself caught up in the rapid deployment of resources that characterized military crisis response. Senior cadets were being assigned to support roles. Faculty members were coordinating with external commands, and the entire Academy was transforming from an educational institution into an operational military facility. The situation that had triggered the emergency protocols quickly became clear through announcements and briefings that echoed through the Academy's communication systems. A Confederation research facility in the Proxima sector had lost contact during what appeared to be an attack by unknown forces. The facility's last transmission had indicated that they were under assault by enemies using tactics and technology that didn't match any known hostile groups. Rescue and reconnaissance operations were being organized with the urgency that characterized responses to situations where time was critical and available information was insufficient. The Academy's advanced cadets were being mobilized to support roles that would free experienced personnel for direct action assignments. Sarah found herself assigned to the Emergency Operations Center as part of a support team responsible for coordinating communications and data analysis. The assignment was routine for senior cadets during crisis situations, but it provided her with a comprehensive view of how Confederation military forces responded to unexpected challenges. What she observed over the following hours reinforced her understanding of galactic military philosophy while highlighting fundamental differences from human approaches to crisis management. Confederation forces operated through carefully structured procedures that emphasize coordination, risk minimization, and adherence to established protocols even under emergency conditions. The rescue operation was planned with meticulous attention to force preservation, communication redundancy, and withdrawal options if the situation proved more dangerous than initial intelligence suggested. Every aspect of the mission was designed to minimize casualties while achieving operational objectives through coordinated action by specialized forces. It was a masterwork of military planning and cultural integration, representing centuries of refined doctrine and proven methods. It was also, by Earth standards, almost painfully cautious in its approach to an emergency where speed and adaptability might prove critical. Sarah found herself observing the planning process with growing concern about the relationship between caution and effectiveness. The thorough preparation was admirable and would undoubtedly reduce risks for the personnel involved. But the time required for such comprehensive planning might cost lives if the research facility's personnel were still alive and under attack. Her concerns proved justified when updated intelligence indicated that the facility was still transmitting automated distress signals, suggesting that at least some systems remained operational despite the attack. The implications were clear. Survivors might still be present and in need of immediate assistance. The updated intelligence created urgency that complicated the careful planning process. Mission parameters had to be adjusted to account for the possibility of survivors while maintaining the safety protocols that governed Confederation military operations. The result was increased complexity that required additional planning time, just when speed had become most critical. Sarah watched the process with the growing frustration of someone whose training had emphasized rapid response to time-critical situations. Every minute spent in planning was a minute not spent moving toward people who might need immediate assistance. When she was finally able to approach Commander Vexhai with her concerns, she found him coordinating multiple aspects of the operation while maintaining the calm professionalism that characterized senior Confederation officers. "Sir," she said, "request permission to make an observation about the mission planning." He looked up from the tactical displays with the expression of someone managing multiple priorities simultaneously. "What is it, Cadet?" "The planning process is comprehensive and will minimize risks to our forces," she began carefully, "but the time requirements might compromise our ability to assist any survivors of the research facility." Commander Vexhai's expression shifted toward the guarded attention that had characterized their interactions since the laughter incident. "Cadet Chun, this operation is being planned by experienced personnel using proven methods. Your observations are noted, but not required." It was a polite dismissal, but Sarah could see the underlying message. Her judgment was no longer considered reliable for serious military situations. The rescue operation launched 6 hours after the initial alert, with forces configured according to established doctrine and equipped for the range of situations they might encounter. The mission proceeded exactly as planned, with coordination between multiple ship types and careful adherence to communication protocols that ensured command oversight throughout the operation. When they reached the research facility, they found exactly what Sarah had feared: evidence of survivors who had held out for several hours after the initial attack before succumbing to injuries that proper medical attention could have treated successfully. The rescue team had arrived too late by a matter of hours, time that had been spent in planning and preparation designed to minimize risks to Confederation forces. The mission was officially classified as a tactical success. The facility was secured, valuable research was recovered, and Confederation forces suffered no casualties during the operation. By every measure that mattered to galactic military doctrine, it had been executed flawlessly. But Sarah couldn't shake the certainty that human approaches to the same situation would have prioritized speed over comprehensive planning, accepting higher risks to Confederation forces in exchange for better chances of reaching survivors in time. When she found herself alone with Commander Vexhai after the post-mission briefings, she made the decision to address the philosophical differences that had become impossible to ignore. "Sir, may I ask you a question about the rescue operation?" He looked at her with the weary expression of someone who had spent hours managing complex logistics followed by detailed debriefings. What is it, Cadet? Would you have approached the mission differently if you had known the outcome in advance? The question was delivered carefully, but its implications were unmistakable. Commander Vexai studied her for a long moment before responding. Cadet Chun, military operations cannot be planned based on unknown outcomes. We use established procedures because they provide the best balance of effectiveness and force preservation across a wide range of situations. Even when those procedures prioritize force preservation over mission objectives, the question struck at fundamental assumptions about military priorities in ways that made the commander visibly uncomfortable. Force preservation is not separate from mission objectives. It is an integral part of mission success. But what if the mission objective is saving lives that are lost while forces are being preserved? Sarah had crossed a line in military philosophy that went beyond cultural differences into questions about the fundamental purposes of military action. Commander Vexai's response carried the weight of professional conviction built over decades of service. Cadet Chun, military forces exist to serve the greater good through organized, disciplined action. Individual operations, regardless of their outcomes, must be conducted in ways that preserve our ability to serve that greater good over time. It was a perspective that made perfect sense from the standpoint of galactic military tradition, but it highlighted the fundamental difference between human and Confederation approaches to acceptable loss. I understand, sir, Sarah replied, though her understanding led to conclusions that would define the rest of her academy experience. Over the following weeks, Sarah's reputation evolved from the human who laughed inappropriately to something more complex and troubling for academy leadership. She had become known as the cadet who questioned fundamental military principles not through rebellion or disrespect, but through questions that challenged the philosophical foundations of Confederation military doctrine. Her academic performance remained excellent. Her tactical innovations continued to impress instructors, and her leadership capabilities showed steady development. But her psychological responses and philosophical perspectives had created concerns about her suitability for command roles in integrated galactic forces. The resolution came during a formal evaluation session 6 months after her arrival at the Academy. Sarah found herself facing a panel that included not only Academy leadership, but also representatives from Confederation Military Command and the Cultural Integration Department. Cadet Chun, the panel chair, announced, "Your performance at this academy has been exceptional in many ways. Your tactical capabilities, academic achievements, and leadership potential all suggest significant promise for military service." Sarah maintained the formal posture appropriate for official evaluations while recognizing that significant decisions were about to be announced. However, the chair continued, "Your psychological responses and philosophical perspectives have raised concerns about compatibility with standard Confederation military culture. The differences appear to be fundamental rather than correctable through additional training." The implications were becoming clear, but Sarah waited for the official conclusion. "Therefore, the panel has decided to recommend you for a specialized assignment that utilizes your capabilities while addressing concerns about cultural integration. You will be assigned to the Confederation's Special Operations Development Program, where your unconventional approaches can be evaluated for their potential contributions to military effectiveness." It was Exile disguised as opportunity, a way to remove her from standard military education while maintaining the possibility that her different perspectives might prove valuable in specialized contexts. "Do you accept this assignment, Cadet?" Sarah considered the alternatives briefly, then made the decision that would define her military career. "Yes, I accept." The assignment would take her away from the Academy's structured environment into a program designed for personnel whose capabilities fell outside normal parameters. It was an opportunity to develop her potential without the constraints of traditional military education, but it also meant leaving behind the integrated training that prepared officers for leadership in conventional forces. As she prepared to leave Kepler Academy, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned during her time among the galaxy's future military leaders. She had discovered that cultural differences went far deeper than language or customs. They extended to fundamental assumptions about risk, responsibility, and the purposes of organized conflict. Her laughter in that debriefing room had revealed philosophical chasms that challenged the foundations of military tradition. Commander Vexhai had never smiled again because he had encountered perspectives that questioned everything he believed about proper military psychology. But Sarah had also learned that different didn't necessarily mean wrong. Her approaches to tactical challenges had consistently produced effective results, even when they violated established procedures. Her willingness to accept personal risk in service of mission objectives had achieved outcomes that standard methods might have missed. The Special Operations Development Program would provide opportunities to explore whether human military psychology could be developed into effective alternatives to traditional approaches, or whether the differences were too fundamental for successful integration. As her transport departed from Kepler Station, Sarah looked back at the academy where she had learned as much about herself as about military science. She had discovered that being a Deathworld girl in a galaxy of civilized species meant carrying perspectives that could either enhance or disrupt established systems, depending on how they were applied. The program she was joining would determine which potential would be realized. Commander Vexhai watched the transport's departure from his office viewport, his expression carrying the weight of professional decisions that had challenged his deepest convictions about military service. The human cadet had forced him to confront questions about the relationship between individual psychology and military effectiveness that went to the heart of everything he had believed about proper leadership. Her laughter had revealed that courage and joy could coexist, that taking pleasure in meeting challenges might enhance rather than compromise the ability to handle responsibility for others' lives. These were possibilities that challenged military traditions refined over centuries, but they were also possibilities that might offer new approaches to the challenges of protecting and serving galactic civilization. He had not smiled since that day in the debriefing room, because smiling would have meant accepting that his understanding of military service might be incomplete. It would have meant acknowledging that the galaxy's newest members might have perspectives to contribute that went beyond simply adapting to established norms. The reports from the Special Operations Development Program would determine whether those possibilities justified the disruption to traditional military culture. Until then, Commander Vexhai would continue his service with the gravity appropriate to decisions that affected the lives of others, carrying the weight of questions that a Deathworld girl's laughter had forced him to confront. In the depths of space, Sarah's transport continued toward assignments that would test whether human approaches to military service could enhance the Confederation's ability to protect and defend the diverse species of the galaxy. Her laughter had challenged assumptions, created opportunities, and forced recognition of differences that might prove either invaluable or incompatible with galactic military needs. The outcome would determine not only her own future, but the future of human participation in the organized defense of galactic civilization. Some lessons, as Sarah had learned, could only be taught by those who had learned to laugh in the face of annihilation. Whether the galaxy was ready to learn those lessons remained to be determined.